The worst pain doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the people who are supposed to love you. For 35 years, I gave everything to build a beautiful life for my daughter Caroline. I worked 70-hour weeks at my accounting firm, skipped vacations and lived in a tiny apartment just to afford her private school tuition, piano lessons, and eventually, an Ivy League education. I dreamed of giving her everything I never had. But sometimes when you give people everything, they forget how to value anything. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never thought I'd end up eating Thanksgiving dinner alone in a freezing garage, surrounded by rusted garden tools and half-empty paint cans, while my daughter and her husband hosted a lavish dinner party just on the other side of the wall. I never imagined my own flesh and blood would let her husband Daniel treat me like something shameful to be hidden away. And I certainly never expected that in the midst of this humiliation, I'd discover the leverage that would change everything. My name is Eleanor Wright. I built Wright Financial Services from nothing but a single desk in my bedroom and an outdated computer. Through persistence and an almost obsessive attention to detail, I transformed it into one of the most respected boutique accounting firms in Oak Ridge. My clients trusted me with their most sensitive financial matters, and I prided myself on integrity above all else. Caroline was just 7 when her father walked out. "Too much responsibility," he said as he packed his bags, leaving me with a mountain of debt and a confused little girl who couldn't understand why Daddy wasn't coming home. I didn't have time to fall apart. The next morning, I was up at 5 a.m., making Caroline's breakfast, packing her lunch, and reviewing client tax returns before dropping her at school. For years, our routine never varied. I worked while she slept, grabbed a few hours of rest when I could, and spent every spare minute making sure Caroline had everything she needed. When the refrigerator broke down, I skipped lunch for 2 months to save up for a new one. When Caroline needed braces, I took on 3 new corporate clients and worked through Christmas. When college acceptance letters arrived, I remortgaged our modest home to cover what the scholarships didn't. "You're going to have every opportunity," I promised her. "Nothing is going to hold you back." Maybe I was trying to protect her too much. Maybe I sheltered her from the harsh realities of what it took to provide the life she enjoyed. Whatever the reason, Caroline grew up with expensive tastes and little understanding of sacrifice. By the time she met Daniel Reynolds in her senior year of college, she was already accustomed to a lifestyle my endless work had provided. Daniel came from what he called old money, though I later discovered the old part only went back 1 generation. His father, Howard Reynolds, had built Reynolds Construction from a small contracting business into a regional development company that specialized in luxury condominiums. Daniel had grown up with every privilege, and it showed in his casual arrogance and the dismissive way he treated service workers. From the moment I met him, something felt off. He had an artificial charm that never quite reached his eyes, but Caroline was smitten. "He's going to be a partner in his father's business," she gushed. "We're going to have such an amazing life." I smiled and kept my concerns to myself. Who was I to judge? Perhaps I was just being overprotective. 6 months after graduation, they were engaged. A year later, they had a wedding that cost more than my annual salary, most of which I paid for by liquidating my retirement portfolio. "It's just money," I told myself. "Her happiness is what matters." For the first few years of their marriage, things were relatively smooth. Daniel joined Reynolds Construction as Vice President of Business Development, a title that seemed suspiciously created just for him. Caroline didn't work. Daniel says it would reflect poorly on him if people thought he couldn't provide for his wife, and instead threw herself into being the perfect corporate spouse, hosting dinner parties and charity events. I kept my distance, visiting only when invited, careful not to impose. I continued building my business, expanding to 15 employees and moving into a proper office building. By the time I hit 60, Wright Financial Services was valued at over $7 million. Not a fortune by any means, but enough to ensure I'd have a comfortable retirement when the time came. Then 3 years ago, everything changed. Howard Reynolds had a massive stroke. After weeks in the hospital, he recovered enough to speak and move around, but the doctors were clear. His days of running a company were over. Daniel was suddenly thrust into the role of CEO, and the pressure was immense. Dad built this business over 40 years, he confided during a rare moment of vulnerability at a family dinner. The board expects me to just step in and take over, but I'm drowning. These development projects are complicated and the financing is a mess. I felt a twinge of sympathy. Despite our differences, I understood the weight of responsibility. I could take a look at the books, I offered. Perhaps give you some advice on restructuring the debt. For once, Daniel didn't dismiss me. Instead, he took me up on the offer, and the next day I found myself in the Reynolds Construction headquarters, surrounded by financial statements and loan documents. What I discovered was troubling. The company had overextended itself on several luxury developments just before the housing market cooled. Cash flow was tight, and several loans were coming due within months. I spent 2 weeks reorganizing their financial approach, negotiating with lenders, and creating a sustainable path forward. I didn't charge a penny. This was family, after all. When I presented my plan to Daniel and the board, the relief in the room was palpable. "Eleanor, this is remarkable," the CFO said, reviewing my proposals. "You've given us a fighting chance." Daniel was effusive in his thanks, inviting me to Sunday dinners and actually listening to my input on business matters. For a brief, shining moment, I thought I'd finally earned his respect. Caroline seemed proud that her mother had saved the day, and I allowed myself to believe our relationship might deepen. How naive I was. As Reynolds Construction stabilized over the next year, I watched Daniel's demeanor shift. The gratitude faded, replaced by the old condescension. His calls became less frequent, and Sunday dinners dwindled away. When I did see them, I noticed subtle changes in their home. New furniture, a second luxury car, designer clothes. Despite my financial guidance emphasizing conservative spending while the company recovered, Daniel was clearly ignoring that advice. Last summer, I got a call from Caroline that sent my world spinning. "Mom, I need to ask you something important," she began, an unusual hesitancy in her voice. "Daniel and I are planning to expand the house, adding a guest wing and pool house. We need some capital to get started, and Daniel suggested that since you're getting older and Wright Financial will need new leadership soon anyway, maybe you'd consider selling it to Reynolds. We could incorporate it as our financial division." I nearly dropped the phone. "Selling my company? Caroline, I built that business from nothing. I'm not ready to retire." "But Mom, you're 63. Most people your age are already retired. And this way you'd still be involved, just not having to work so hard." Daniel says. "I don't care what Daniel says," I interrupted, immediately regretting my sharp tone. "Wright Financial is not for sale. Not now, maybe not ever." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Caroline spoke again, her voice had cooled significantly. "Daniel thought you might be difficult about this. He said you've always been stubborn about accepting help." Help? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Caroline, this isn't help. This is Daniel trying to acquire a successful business at what I'm guessing would be a fraction of its market value." "You always do this," she sighed. "You always think people are trying to take advantage of you. Daniel has been nothing but generous, offering you a place in his company when most people your age would be put out to pasture." Her words stung like a physical slap. "Put out to pasture? Is that how you see me? As some old cow that's outlived its usefulness?" "That's not what I meant, and you know it. Look, just think about it, okay? This could be good for everyone." After we hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the walls covered with professional certifications and awards I'd earned over decades of hard work. For the first time, I wondered if Caroline had ever truly seen me, not just as her provider, her safety net, but as a woman with dreams and accomplishments of her own. 2 weeks later, I received a formal offer letter from Reynolds Construction, proposing to acquire Wright Financial Services for $5 million, about a third of its actual value. I declined politely but firmly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This triggered a barrage of calls from both Caroline and Daniel, each more pressuring than the last. When I remained unmoved, the calls stopped altogether. By October, I hadn't heard from either of them in over a month, the longest we'd ever gone without speaking. Then, surprisingly, I received a text from Caroline inviting me to Thanksgiving dinner. "The whole family will be there," she wrote. "Daniel's parents, his sister and her husband, some close friends. It would mean a lot if you came." I was overjoyed at the olive branch and accepted immediately. Perhaps they'd reconsidered their approach. Perhaps we could move past this unfortunate episode and be a family again. How wrong I was. When Thanksgiving Day arrived, I dressed carefully in a navy blue dress I'd bought specially for the occasion, packed a homemade pumpkin pie, Caroline's favorite since childhood, and drove to their sprawling colonial home in the most exclusive neighborhood in Oak Ridge. I was nervous but hopeful as I rang the doorbell. Caroline answered, air-kissing my cheek and taking the pie with a distracted, "Thanks." Something seemed off immediately. The house was filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, the smell of turkey and spices wafting from the kitchen. "Everyone's already here," she said, leading me not toward the dining room but toward the back of the house. "Daniel thought it might be best if you ate in the garage apartment." I stopped in my tracks. "The garage apartment? But you said this was a family dinner." Caroline looked uncomfortable, glancing back toward the dining room. "It is, but Daniel invited some important investors at the last minute. The dining room is at capacity, and you know how small our table is." I'd been in their dining room. Their small table could comfortably seat 16 people. "The investors are very traditional," she continued hurriedly. "They might not understand why the CEO's mother-in-law is at a business dinner. It could seem unprofessional." I stood there, purse clutched in my suddenly trembling hands as the truth dawned on me. This wasn't a reconciliation. This was a further humiliation. They'd invited me not to include me, but to put me firmly in what they considered my place. Out of sight, separated from the important people. "The garage apartment isn't finished," I said quietly. "You told me construction was still underway." Caroline shifted uncomfortably. "Well, yes, but the space is cleared out enough. There's a folding table set up, and Daniel had the staff make you a plate. It's very private. You'll be comfortable." Before I could respond, Daniel appeared, all smiles and false warmth. "Eleanor, glad you could make it. Look, slight change of plans. We have some VIPs here tonight, potential investors for our new downtown project. Very exclusive opportunity." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Between us, if this deal goes through, Reynolds Construction will double in value overnight." I looked into his eyes, cold and calculating despite the smile, and suddenly understood with perfect clarity. This dinner wasn't about Thanksgiving at all. It was a business meeting disguised as a holiday gathering, and I was an inconvenient, loose end to be tucked away. "We've set up a nice little spot for you in the garage," Daniel continued smoothly. "Very quiet. You can watch your shows on your phone and eat in peace. No noisy conversations to deal with." He smiled as if he'd just offered me a great gift. "Carla will bring you a plate shortly." I've faced many difficult moments in my life, my husband walking out, near bankruptcy in the early days of my business, Caroline's teenage rebellions. But nothing had prepared me for the sheer humiliation of that moment. My own daughter was banishing me to eat alone in a garage while she and her husband entertained important people on a holiday meant for family. For a moment, I considered leaving. I could walk out the door with what remained of my dignity and never look back. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Perhaps shock. Perhaps a morbid curiosity to see just how far they would take this charade. "Fine," I said quietly. "Show me to the garage." Daniel looked relieved, clearly having expected more resistance. He led me through the laundry room and out a side door into the attached 3-car garage. One bay had been partially cleared, with a metal folding table and a single chair set up next to some storage shelves. A small space heater hummed ineffectively against the November chill. "Carla will be right out with your food," he said, already backing toward the door. "The Wi-Fi password is on that sticky note if you want to stream something." And with that, he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. I stood alone in the cavernous garage, surrounded by gardening equipment, sports, gear, and boxes. Through the wall, I could faintly hear the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. The contrast between the warmth and celebration just feet away and my cold makeshift dining spot was so stark it was almost comical. 20 minutes later, a flustered-looking housekeeper appeared with a plate of food: turkey, mashed potatoes, and green beans, all lukewarm and hastily arranged. She couldn't meet my eyes as she set it down on the metal table. "Mrs. Wright, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "This isn't right. I tried to tell them." "It's not your fault, Carla," I assured her, recognizing her from previous visits. "Thank you for bringing this out." She hesitated, then quickly pulled a dinner roll wrapped in a napkin from her pocket. "I saved this for you. The good ones with the butter inside. They're almost gone in there." The small act of kindness nearly undid me. I thanked her and she hurried back inside, clearly afraid of being caught showing me compassion. I sat down at the wobbly folding table and stared at my cooling Thanksgiving dinner. 35 years of sacrifice had led to this moment. I'd given everything to provide Caroline with opportunities, security, love, and in return, I was deemed unworthy of a seat at her table. I picked up my fork, then set it down again without taking a bite. The garage was cold despite the space heater, and the distant sounds of celebration only emphasized my isolation. I pulled my phone from my purse, thinking I might distract myself with a video as Daniel had so generously suggested, when an email notification appeared on my screen. It was from Howard Reynolds, Daniel's father. Subject: "Need to talk. Urgent." The message was brief. "Eleanor, cannot reach you by phone. Daniel making catastrophic mistake with Westfield Heights project. Using company as personal piggy bank. Board being misled. Have documentation. Need your financial expertise before it's too late. Please call. Confidential line only. 555-0192. Howard." I stared at the screen, my dinner forgotten. Howard Reynolds, who had been sidelined after his stroke, was reaching out to me directly, bypassing his own son. And he had documentation of financial misconduct. In that cold garage, sitting at a folding table with a plate of cooling food, something shifted inside me. The hurt and humiliation didn't disappear, but they were joined by something else. A calm, clear certainty about what needed to happen next. I stood up, leaving my untouched dinner on the table. I took one last look around the garage, at the luxury cars parked in the other bays, the expensive golf clubs, the high-end mountain, bikes, all symbols of the prosperity that my financial rescue had helped make possible. Then I walked out through the side door into the crisp November air, got into my car, and drove away without looking back. As I pulled out of their driveway, I called the number Howard had sent. Despite the holiday, he answered on the second. "Ring, Eleanor, thank God. We need to talk. How soon can you come over?" "I'm on my way now," I replied, a new resolve strengthening my voice. And Howard, bring every document you have. We're going to need all of it. I didn't know it then, but that Thanksgiving dinner in the garage would be the last time Caroline and Daniel would ever have the upper hand. Their decision to humiliate me had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to their financial ruin and my most unexpected triumph. Little did they know that while they were clinking glasses with investors, their business empire was already beginning to crumble. And I, the mother-in-law they had banished to the garage, would soon hold their entire future in my hands. Howard. Reynolds lived in an elegant townhouse in the historic district of Oak Ridge. Despite the late hour and holiday, his nurse let me in immediately, as if I'd been expected all along. The foyer was dimly lit, family photos lining the walls, snapshots of happier times, when Howard stood tall and confident beside construction sites and ribbon cuttings. Now, those images felt like artifacts from another life. I found Howard in his study, a room that smelled of leather-bound books and expensive cigars he could no longer enjoy. His stroke had left him with a slight droop to the left side of his face and a tremor in his hand, but his eyes were sharp and alert. The moment he saw me, relief washed over his features. "Eleanor," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his. "Thank you for coming, especially today." "You said it was urgent," I replied, settling into the leather armchair. "And to be frank, my Thanksgiving dinner was rather abruptly concluded." A knowing look crossed his face. "Daniel's doing, I assume?" I wasn't there to discuss family drama, so I simply nodded and moved on. "Your email mentioned documentation. Something about the Westfield Heights project?" Howard reached for a folder on his desk, his hand trembling slightly with the effort. "Daniel thinks I'm too addled to understand what's happening to my own company. He visits for 15 minutes once a week, pats my hand, and tells me everything's fine while feeding me sanitized reports." He pushed the folder toward me. "But Reynolds Construction has been my life for 40 years. I still have friends in the industry, loyal employees who respect me more than they fear my son." I opened the folder and found myself staring at internal financial statements, bank transfers, loan applications, and email printouts. Even at first glance, I could see why Howard was alarmed. The Westfield Heights project, a luxury condominium, development that was supposed to be Reynolds Construction's crowning achievement, was being systematically bled dry. "He's siphoning funds," I said, flipping through the pages. "Moving money from the construction budget into, what are these shell companies? Coastal Ventures, Blue Harbor Holdings, and Pinnacle Investments," Howard replied, his voice tight, with controlled anger. "All registered to anonymous LLCs, but my sources confirmed they trace back to Daniel and several of his college friends. He's been draining millions meant for Westfield Heights and funneling it into these entities." I continued reviewing the documents, my accountant's mind cataloging each violation. "These equipment rentals are billed at 3 times market rate. These subcontractors don't even exist. And these material costs are grossly inflated. Meanwhile, the actual construction is using substandard materials," Howard added, sliding over photos of the development site. "They're cutting corners everywhere while billing for premium quality. When these condos start falling apart in 5 years, Reynolds Construction will be destroyed. Not just financially, but our reputation will be ruined. My life's work gone." "Why not take this to the board?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Howard's bitter laugh confirmed my suspicion. "Daniel replaced 3 board members with his fraternity brothers last year. The others are kept in the dark with manipulated reports. The ones who ask questions get intimidated into silence or pushed out." I leaned back, processing everything. "And what exactly do you want me to do, Howard? I'm not a board member or a shareholder in Reynolds Construction." "No," he agreed, "but you're the best financial investigator I know. You saved the company once before when you restructured our debt. And more importantly, you have no reason to protect Daniel, not after how he's treated you." I raised an eyebrow. You seem remarkably well informed about my personal situation. Howard had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Carla, their housekeeper, is my nurse's cousin. Word travels. What they did to you today was unforgivable. And you want revenge? I asked bluntly. I want justice, he corrected. For the company, for the employees whose jobs are at risk, for the clients who trust us to build safe, quality homes. He paused, meeting my gaze directly. And yes, maybe a little revenge too. My son has become someone I don't recognize, and perhaps it's partly my fault for giving him everything without teaching him the value of anything. I thought of Caroline, how my own desire to give her everything might have contributed to her sense of entitlement. Was I any different from Howard in that regard? What exactly are you proposing? I asked. Howard leaned forward, his voice dropping. 3 years ago, when you restructured our financing, you arranged a consolidated loan through First Meridian Bank to pay off our various debts. That loan had specific covenants regarding financial reporting, project completion timelines, and fund usage. I nodded, remembering the details. Yes, it was quite strict. The bank was taking a substantial risk given the company's situation at the time. Those covenants are being violated 6 ways from Sunday, Howard said. Daniel thinks he's covered his tracks by submitting fraudulent reports, but a real forensic accountant, someone like you, could expose everything. And then what? The bank calls the loan? Exactly. Reynolds Construction would have 90 days to repay $28 million, which they can't do because Daniel has drained the cash reserves. I sat back, understanding the full implications. That would force the company into bankruptcy. Howard nodded grimly. But here's where it gets interesting. When I set up the original financing for Westfield Heights, before my stroke, I secured it with a separate lending agreement through Oak Ridge Trust. That agreement has a unique clause that gives the lender the right to foreclose specifically on the Westfield Heights project in the event of default, separate from other company assets. And who controls that loan now? I asked, though I was beginning to see where this was heading. Howard smiled thinly. I do, through a family trust that Daniel doesn't control. It's one of the few things I kept separate as a safety measure. He pulled out another document. And I'm prepared to assign that loan to you at a significant discount from its face value. If Reynolds Construction defaults on their main loan, which they will once their violations are exposed, you would have the legal right to foreclose on Westfield Heights. I stared at him, the audacity of the plan sinking in. You'd give me the power to take away your son's flagship project? I'd give you the power to save it, he corrected. You have the financial expertise to complete it properly, without the corner cutting and fraud. You could either finish it yourself or sell it to a reputable developer. Either way, Daniel loses his cash cow and faces the consequences of his actions. My mind was racing. With my background and contacts, I could certainly pull this off. Wright Financial Services had handled complex property transactions before, though nothing of this scale. And what do you get out of this arrangement? I asked, still wary. Howard's expression softened. Peace of mind, knowing that my company's name won't be attached to a dangerous substandard building that could hurt people. Knowing that the employees who've been loyal to me for decades won't suffer for my son's greed. He paused. And yes, a lesson taught to a son who's forgotten every value I tried to instill in him. I considered the proposal carefully. Was I really contemplating this level of retaliation? Taking down not just Daniel, but potentially affecting Caroline and others in the process. Then I remembered sitting alone in that cold garage, the sounds of laughter echoing through the wall, the message clear. I was no longer family. I was an inconvenience to be hidden away. I'll need time to review everything thoroughly, I said finally. And I'll want my own legal team to look over the loan assignment. Howard nodded, clearly expecting this response. Of course, but we need to move quickly. The deeper Daniel digs this hole, the more damage will be done to innocent people. I understand, I said, gathering the documents into the folder. I'll be in touch within 48 hours. As I stood to leave, Howard caught my hand. His grip was weaker than it once had been, but still conveyed urgency. Eleanor, one more thing. If you do this, there's no going back. Daniel will know. Someone exposed him. He'll come looking for whoever is responsible. I thought of my daughter's dismissive tone, her willingness to banish me to the garage while she dined with important people. I thought of Daniel's calculated effort to acquire my company at a fraction of its worth. Let him come, I said quietly. I'll be ready. The next morning, while most people were enjoying leftover turkey and family time, I was in my office, with the shades drawn, meticulously going through Howard's documents. By midday, I'd confirmed his allegations. The fraud was extensive and systematic, with millions diverted from the Westfield Heights project into Daniel's personal ventures. I called my attorney, Vivian Chen, and asked her to meet me immediately. Vivian had been with me since the early days of Wright Financial, starting as an intern while putting herself through law school. Now she headed her own firm but remained my most trusted legal advisor. On Black Friday? Really, Eleanor? She grumbled, but showed up 40 minutes later, stylish even in casual clothes. I spread the documents across my conference table. I need you to verify the legality of this loan assignment and confirm that the foreclosure clause would be enforceable. Vivian raised an eyebrow at the Reynolds construction letterhead, but asked no questions as she began reviewing. After an hour of silent reading, occasionally making notes, she looked up. This is solid. The clause is unusual but perfectly legal. If you acquire this loan and Reynolds Construction defaults on their main financing, you'd have clear rights to foreclose specifically on the Westfield Heights project. She paused. But Eleanor, this is Daniel's project, Caroline's husband. This would be... What? I asked when she didn't finish. Ruthless? Crossing a line? I was going to... say life-changing, she replied carefully. For everyone involved, including you. I nodded, appreciating her candor. I know. But sometimes lines need to be crossed when others have already trampled all boundaries of decency and respect. Vivian didn't press further. She'd been with me long enough to know when I'd made up my mind. If you're going forward, we need to maintain absolute secrecy. The loan assignment should be made to a newly created LLC, not directly to you or Wright Financial. We'll need to establish a paper trail that obscures your involvement until the moment you're ready to act. Can you set that up? Of course. I'll have the LLC formed by Monday. But Eleanor... She hesitated, concern evident in her expression. What about Caroline? She's still your daughter. The question struck deeper than I wanted to admit. Caroline was my only child, the person for whom I'd sacrificed everything. But the daughter I'd raised seemed increasingly unrecognizable to me. Caroline has made her choice, I said finally. She's chosen Daniel and his world. Maybe seeing that world crumble will wake her up to reality. Vivian nodded, not entirely convinced but respectful of my decision. I'll need a name for the LLC. I thought for a moment, then smiled slightly. Phoenix Recovery. Rising from the ashes, Vivian noted. Appropriate. Over the next week, we put the plan into motion. Phoenix Recovery LLC was established with a complex ownership structure that couldn't be easily traced back to me. Howard assigned the Westfield Heights loan to the new entity at 60 cents on the dollar. Still a substantial investment on my part, but one that could pay off enormously if successful. Meanwhile, I assembled a team of forensic accountants from Wright Financial to prepare a comprehensive report on Reynolds Construction's financial violations. We worked discreetly, pulling information from public records, industry contacts, and the documents Howard had provided. The report, when completed, was devastating. A meticulous, irrefutable account of fraud, mismanagement, and criminal financial manipulation. I had it bound in a professional portfolio with the First Meridian Bank logo on the cover. Then I made an appointment with Diane Harper, the bank's chief risk officer and, not coincidentally, a longtime client of Wright Financial. Eleanor. Diane greeted me warmly in her corner office overlooking the Oak Ridge skyline. Always a pleasure, though I admit I'm curious about the urgent nature of this meeting. I placed the portfolio on her desk. Diane, I've come across information that significantly impacts one of your major loans. Before I explain further, I need your assurance that this conversation remains confidential. She frowned slightly but nodded. Of course, client confidentiality is fundamental to our relationship. This isn't about one of my clients, I clarified. It's about Reynolds Construction. Her expression shifted immediately to one of professional concern. The Reynolds loan is one of our largest commercial commitments. Is there something I should know? Everything in this report, I said, tapping the portfolio. I've uncovered systematic fraud in their Westfield Heights development. They're violating multiple covenants in your loan agreement while submitting falsified reports to cover it up. Diane's face hardened as she opened the portfolio and began scanning its contents. I watched as her professional demeanor gave way to growing alarm. These diversions of funds, she muttered, flipping pages. The substandard materials, falsified inspection reports. She looked up sharply. How did you come by this information? I have sources within the company who are concerned about potential liability, I said, keeping my answer deliberately vague. Everything in that report can be independently verified through the documentation provided. Diane continued reading, her expression growing graver by the minute. This is extensive, criminal, potentially. She closed the portfolio and fixed me with a penetrating stare. Eleanor, I appreciate you bringing this to our attention, but I have to ask, why? What's your interest in Reynolds Construction? I had prepared for this question. Professional integrity. The banking and financial services communities in Oak Ridge are closely connected. If Reynolds defaults on this loan due to fraud, it affects all of us. And, I added, deciding a partial truth would be more convincing, I did some consulting work for them after Howard's stroke. I feel a certain responsibility to ensure that work isn't undermined by subsequent mismanagement. Diane seemed to accept this explanation. We'll need to verify everything, of course. Of course, I agreed. Take whatever time you need. But I would suggest moving with some urgency. The longer this continues, the more funds are being diverted. She nodded, already reaching for her phone. I'll have our audit team begin immediately. Thank you, Eleanor. This was unexpected, but I appreciate your professional courtesy in bringing it forward. As I left her office, I felt a strange mix of emotions: satisfaction that the plan was in motion, anxiety about the consequences, and an undeniable twinge of guilt about what this would mean for Caroline. But I pushed that last feeling aside. My daughter had made her choices. Now she would have to live with the results. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of calculated moves and counteractions. First, Meridian Bank conducted their audit with ruthless efficiency, verifying every allegation in my report. They found even more irregularities than I had documented. On December 18th, 2 weeks before Christmas, the bank formally notified Reynolds Construction that they were in violation of multiple loan covenants. They demanded immediate remedy of all violations and full repayment of the $28 million loan within 90 days, as specified in the agreement. The news hit the local business community like a bombshell. Reynolds Construction stock, which traded on a regional exchange, plummeted 40% in a single day. Construction at Westfield Heights and other projects ground to a halt as subcontractors, now worried about getting paid, pulled their workers. I watched it all unfold from a distance, neither celebrating nor intervening. This was only phase 1. Daniel's response was predictable, a combination of public denials, frantic behind-the-scenes negotiations, and increasingly desperate attempts to raise capital. He gave interviews claiming the bank's audit was flawed, insisted Reynolds Construction was financially sound, and promised that all projects would continue on schedule. But the financial community in Oak Ridge was small and tightly connected. Word of Daniel's fraud spread quickly, making potential investors wary. No one wanted to throw good money after bad, especially with the specter of possible criminal charges looming. I wasn't surprised when my phone rang on a snowy evening in early January. The caller ID showed Caroline's number. It was the first time she'd contacted me since Thanksgiving. For a moment, I considered not answering, but curiosity, and perhaps a lingering hope for reconciliation, led me to pick up. "Hello, Caroline." "Mom." Her voice sounded strained, exhausted. We need to talk. Can I come over?" I hesitated, wondering what her agenda might be. "I'm free now if you'd like to stop by." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said, then hung up without waiting for a response. I sat in my living room, watching snow fall gently outside the window, and prepared myself for whatever was coming. Was this a genuine attempt to mend fences? Or had Daniel sent her as an emissary to seek financial help? The doorbell rang precisely 18 minutes later. When I opened the door, I barely recognized my daughter. The polished, confident woman who had dismissed me at Thanksgiving was gone. In her place stood someone with dark circles under her eyes, unwashed hair, and a rumpled coat that looked slept in. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside wordlessly, allowing her to enter. She moved, past me into the living room, taking in the familiar surroundings with an almost hungry gaze, as if remembering better times. "Would you like some tea?" I offered, keeping my tone neutral. "Please," she whispered, sinking onto the couch. I busied myself in the kitchen, using the familiar ritual of tea-making to collect my thoughts. When I returned with 2 steaming mugs, Caroline was staring at the family photos on my mantel, pictures from her childhood, her graduation, simpler times. "Thank you," she said, accepting the tea. She wrapped her hands around the mug as if seeking warmth beyond what the beverage provided. We sat in silence for a long moment before she finally spoke. "Everything's falling apart, Mom," she said, her voice barely audible. "The company, our reputation, our future. Daniel doesn't know what to do." I sipped my tea, waiting for more. "The bank is demanding immediate repayment of a huge loan. All the projects are stopped. The investors Daniel was courting at Thanksgiving have pulled out. We've even had to let most of the household staff go." She looked up, tears in her eyes. "Daniel's talking about bankruptcy." "I see," I said carefully. "And why are you telling me this?" Caroline flinched slightly at my tone. I thought you might have advice, financial guidance. You've always been good at solving problems." "Like when I restructured Reynolds Construction's debt after Howard's stroke?" I asked pointedly. "Or when Daniel tried to acquire my company at 1/3 of its value to finance your home renovation?" Her face flushed. "That was Daniel's idea, not mine. I went along with it because he said it made sense." "And does making me eat Thanksgiving dinner alone in a cold garage make sense too? Was that also Daniel's idea?" The direct question seemed to catch her off guard. For a moment, genuine shame crossed her features. That was wrong. We were wrong. I'm sorry, Mom. I should never have let that happen." I studied my daughter's face, looking for sincerity. Was this genuine remorse, or simply the desperation of someone whose privileged life was crumbling? "Caroline," I said finally, "I appreciate the apology, but I have to ask, would you be sitting here now if Reynolds Construction wasn't in crisis? Would you have ever acknowledged how wrongly you treated me if your life wasn't falling apart? Tears spilled down her cheeks. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe not soon enough. I've been lost, I guess. Caught up in Daniel's world, trying to be what he wanted. Her honesty, however painful, was at least a start. But I couldn't forget how quickly she'd abandoned me when it suited her purposes. What exactly do you want from me? I asked directly. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Daniel doesn't know I'm here. He's too proud to ask for help, especially from you. But I thought, maybe you could look at the situation, see if there's a way out. You saved the company once before. I set down my tea mug carefully. And if I did help, what would change? Would Daniel suddenly respect me? Would I be welcome at your table next, Thanksgiving, or would I be sent back to the garage when I'm no longer useful? Caroline winced at the harshness of my questions. It wouldn't be like that, she insisted. Daniel knows he made mistakes. He's desperate, Mom. We both are. Desperation isn't the same as growth or change, I observed. It's just fear of consequences. She looked down at her hands. What can I say to convince you we've learned our lesson? Nothing, I replied honestly. Words don't matter now, only actions. And from what I can see, Daniel's actions are those of someone scrambling to save himself, not someone who's had a moral awakening. Caroline's shoulders slumped in defeat. So, you won't help us? I considered my next words carefully. This was a pivotal moment, perhaps my last chance to reach my daughter before the next phase of my plan unfolded. I'll make you an offer, I said slowly. Not to save Reynolds Construction, that's beyond salvaging in its current form, but to give you a personal lifeline. She looked up, eyes wide with surprise and nascent hope. Leave Daniel, I stated simply. Move back home. With me for a while. Get some perspective. Find the Caroline I raised, not the woman who would watch her mother eat holiday dinner in a garage. Her mouth opened in shock. Leave. But Mom, he's my husband. We're going through a rough patch, but we're still a family. Are you? I asked pointedly. Or are you just an accessory to his ambitions? Does he value you, Carolyn, or what you represent, the perfect corporate wife who never questions his decisions? That's not fair, she protested. But I could see doubt creeping into her expression. Isn't it? When was the last time Daniel asked about your dreams, your goals? When was the last time you even remembered having any of your own? She had no immediate answer, which told me everything. Think about it, I continued more gently. My door is open to you, just you, not as a package deal with Daniel. If you decide your marriage is truly worth saving after you've had some distance and perspective, that will be your choice. But right now, you're drowning alongside him, and I'm offering you a lifeboat. Caroline stared at me for a long moment, conflict evident in her eyes. Finally, she set down her mug and stood up. I need to think about this, she said quietly. It's a lot to process. I nodded, also rising. Take the time you need. But Caroline, I added as she moved toward the door, don't wait too long. Things are going to move quickly with Reynolds Construction in the coming weeks. She paused, hand on the doorknob. What do you mean by that? I met her gaze evenly. Just that bankruptcy proceedings have a momentum of their own once they begin. Make your decisions before others make them for you. As I watched her car disappear down my snowy driveway, I wondered if I'd done the right thing. Was offering her an escape hatch an act of maternal love, or was I simply ensuring I wouldn't be collateral damage in the destruction I was about to unleash? Either way, the next phase of my plan was already in motion. That morning, First Meridian Bank had formally declared Reynolds Construction in default after the company failed to provide an acceptable remediation plan for the covenant violations. The 90-day repayment clock was now ticking, but everyone in the financial community knew they wouldn't last that long. The stage was set for Phoenix Recovery to make its move. And when it did, Daniel Reynolds would discover that the mother-in-law he had banished to the garage now held the foreclosure papers to his entire empire. The mid-January morning dawned steel gray and bitter cold, perfect weather for what was about to unfold. I dressed with particular care. A charcoal gray suit, pearl earrings, and the ruby brooch that had been my grandmother's. There's something about facing your adversaries that demands armor, even if it's only psychological. Vivian arrived promptly at 8:30, immaculate in a navy pantsuit, carrying a sleek leather portfolio. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" she asked, not for the first time since our plan had been set in motion. "More certain than I've been about anything in years," I replied, checking my reflection one last time. The woman staring back at me looked calm, determined, powerful. Everything I needed to be today. We took my car to the Reynolds Construction headquarters, a gleaming glass building that had once symbolized Howard's success and now represented Daniel's hubris. The lobby was notably emptier than on my previous visits, the atmosphere subdued. A receptionist I didn't recognize directed us to the main conference room on the executive floor. "They think we're from First Meridian Bank," Vivian murmured as we stepped into the elevator. "The element of surprise is still intact." I nodded, steeling myself for what was to come. "Remember, let me take the lead, no matter how heated things." The conference room was already occupied when we arrived. Daniel sat at the head of the table, hair perfectly coiffed despite the dark circles under his eyes. Caroline sat beside him, and I felt a momentary pang seeing her there. She hadn't contacted me since our conversation at my home. Had she even considered my offer, or had loyalty to Daniel won out automatically? Flanking them were Reynolds Construction's CFO, Greg Patterson, and their corporate attorney, Martin Wells, a shark in an expensive suit known for aggressive tactics. Two other board members I recognized from company events filled out their side of the table. The moment I walked through the door, Daniel's expression shifted from professional neutrality to shock, then immediate hostility. "What the hell is she doing here?" he demanded, half rising from his chair. Caroline's face had gone pale, her eyes darting between Daniel and me with something akin to panic. I smiled pleasantly, as if I'd been invited to a dinner party rather than walking into hostile territory. "Good morning, Daniel. I believe we have some business to discuss." Martin Wells recovered first. Mr. Reynolds was expecting representatives from First Meridian Bank. "This meeting is private and by invitation only." Vivian stepped forward smoothly. "We're not from First Meridian. I'm Vivian Chen, legal counsel, and this is Eleanor Wright, of Phoenix Recovery LLC. "Phoenix Recovery?" Greg Patterson frowned, flipping through papers in front of him. "That entity isn't on our creditor list." "It is now," I said, taking a seat at the table without waiting for an invitation. "Phoenix Recovery has acquired the senior secured loan on the Westfield Heights development from Oak Ridge Trust." A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications sank in. Daniel's face flushed dark red. "That's impossible," he sputtered. "That loan is held in my father's family trust. He would, and he did," I interrupted calmly. Howard was quite concerned about the direction of the project, particularly the fraudulent financial reporting and substandard materials being used. Daniel slammed his fist on the table. "This is absurd. You've manipulated a sick old man." "Your father is cognitively sound and legally competent," Vivian interjected, her tone professionally detached. The loan assignment was properly executed and recorded. Phoenix Recovery now holds all rights and remedies associated with the Westfield Heights financing. Martin Wells leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "Even if that's true, which we'll need. To verify, First Meridian is our primary lender. Any discussions about Reynolds Construction's financial situation should include them." I smiled thinly. By all means, call them, but I should mention that I met with First Meridian yesterday to inform them of our position. They're quite aware that Phoenix Recovery has the right to foreclose specifically on Westfield Heights, regardless of any arrangements you might make regarding their larger corporate loan. Caroline finally found her voice. Mom, what are you doing? There was genuine confusion in her eyes, as if she couldn't quite reconcile the poised, strategic woman before her with the mother she'd relegated to the garage on Thanksgiving. Business. Caroline, I replied evenly. Just business. Daniel's face had taken on an alarming shade of purple. This is your revenge, isn't it? For Thanksgiving. You're that petty? I met his gaze directly, refusing to rise to the bait. This has nothing to do with personal matters. Phoenix Recovery has made a significant investment in acquiring this loan. We're simply protecting our financial interests, just as you've always protected yours. Greg Patterson, the CFO, looked increasingly uncomfortable. Perhaps we should take a step back and discuss practical next steps. What exactly does Phoenix Recovery want? Full repayment of the Westfield Heights loan within 14 days, or we begin foreclosure proceedings, I stated simply. Martin, Wells scoffed. That's $12 million. You know very well the company doesn't have that kind of liquidity right now. Then perhaps Mr. Reynolds should consider liquidating some personal assets, I suggested mildly. The vacation home in Aspen, the yacht, the art collection. I believe there's a Monet that would cover a substantial portion of the debt. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. How did I know about the Monet? It had been a private purchase, not widely known outside their immediate circle. But Howard had been thorough in his intelligence gathering. This is outrageous, Daniel sputtered. You can't just walk in here and demand immediate payment. I can, and I am, I replied calmly. But I'm also prepared to offer an alternative. The room went silent again, all eyes fixed on me. Phoenix Recovery would consider accepting a controlling interest in Westfield Heights in lieu of immediate cash repayment. We would become the majority partner, with full authority over project management, financial controls, and completion. Daniel let out a harsh laugh. You want to take over our flagship project? A retired accountant with no development experience? That's delusional. I smiled, unruffled by his condescension. Phoenix Recovery has already assembled a project management team comprised of industry veterans, including several former Reynolds construction executives who left during your leadership transition. We're fully prepared to complete the development properly, using quality materials and legitimate contractors. The revelation that I'd been recruiting his former executives seemed to hit Daniel like a physical blow. His face drained of color as he realized how thoroughly I'd prepared. This is a hostile takeover, he said hoarsely. This is accountability, I corrected. Something you seem to have avoided for quite some time. Martin Wells leaned in to whisper something to Daniel, who shook his head vehemently. The attorney persisted, and finally Daniel gave a curt nod. We need time to review your claims and discuss options, Martin announced. I suggest we adjourn and reconvene in 48 hours. Vivian glanced at me for confirmation. I gave a slight nod. That's acceptable, she responded. But the 14-day clock is already ticking, and should Reynolds Construction file for bankruptcy protection before we reach an agreement, be advised that Phoenix Recovery will immediately petition the court for relief from stay to proceed with the Westfield Heights foreclosure. We rose to leave, gathering our materials with unhurried precision. As we reached the door, Caroline suddenly stood up. Mom, wait. I paused, turning to face my daughter. Her expression was a complicated mixture of hurt, confusion, and something that might have been dawning respect. Was this what you meant? She asked quietly. When you said things would move quickly? I met her gaze steadily. Yes, my offer to you still stands, Caroline. It's separate from all of this. I gestured at the conference room, at Daniel and his team huddled in urgent conversation. Think carefully about what you truly want. and whose future you want to be tied to. Daniel's head snapped up. What offer? What is she talking about? I didn't wait to see Caroline's response. Vivian and I walked out, the heavy door swinging, shut behind us with a decisive click. In the elevator, Vivian exhaled slowly. That went about as expected. Daniel is furious but backed into a corner. He'll try to find a way out, I noted. Probably approach Howard directly to rescind the loan assignment. Already anticipated, Vivian assured me. Howard left this morning for his medical rehabilitation center in Arizona. He'll be unavailable for intensive treatment for the next 3 weeks, by which time everything will be settled one way or another. I nodded, impressed yet again by Vivian's thoroughness. And First Meridian? Fully briefed and on board. They're actually relieved to have us deal with Westfield Heights separately. It simplifies their position with the rest of Reynolds Construction's assets. As we exited the building into the crisp winter air, I felt lighter than I had in months. The confrontation had gone exactly as planned, with Daniel caught completely off guard. Phase 3 of my strategy was now in motion. What now? Vivian asked as we reached my car. Now we wait, I replied. Daniel will scramble to find financing, call in favors, maybe even try to sell assets quickly. But given the company's current reputation and his own damaged credibility, I doubt he'll succeed within 14 days. And if he somehow does? I smiled slightly. Then we take the money and walk away. But I don't think that's how this will play out. I was right. Over the next week, Reynolds Construction's desperate maneuvers played out exactly as I'd anticipated. Daniel approached several local banks for emergency financing, only to be rebuffed. He tried to sell off smaller projects to generate cash, but potential buyers, aware of the company's precarious position, offered only pennies on the dollar. News of the company's troubles had spread throughout the Oak Ridge business community. Subcontractors demanded payment up front before returning to job sites. Suppliers put orders on hold. The regional stock exchange suspended trading of Reynolds Construction shares pending financial clarification. I watched it all unfold from a distance, neither intervening nor celebrating. This wasn't about joy or revenge, it was about justice and consequences. On day 10, my phone rang. It was Caroline again. Can we meet? She asked without preamble. Not at your house this time. Somewhere neutral. We arranged to meet at Riverside Park at a secluded bench overlooking the water. When I arrived, Caroline was already there, bundled against the cold in a parka I didn't recognize, simpler and less ostentatious than her usual attire. Thank you for coming, she said as I sat beside her. I studied her face, noting the signs of stress, but also a certain clarity in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Of course. We sat in silence for a moment, watching a pair of ducks navigate the partially frozen river. You're really going to take Westfield Heights, she said. Finally, not a question but a statement of acceptance. Yes. Daniel's tried everything, called in every favor, begged every contact. She shook her head slowly. Nobody will touch us. The banks, investors, even his college friends, they've all disappeared. I said nothing, waiting for her to continue. He's different now, she went on, her voice lower. Angry all the time, drinking too much. Last night he threw a glass against the wall when I suggested selling the house to pay off some debt. A flicker of concern passed through me. Has he ever been violent toward you? No, she said quickly. Not physically, just the anger, the blame. He says none of this would have happened if I'd kept you happy, kept you in line. The words stung, revealing just how Daniel truly viewed my daughter, not as a partner, but as a tool to manage her mother. And what do you think? I asked carefully. Caroline turned to look at me directly. I think I've been blind to who he really is to who I've become around him. She paused, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "I'm leaving him, Mom. I've already packed what matters. The rest. It's just stuff." A complex wave of emotions washed over me. Relief, vindication, and a deep, abiding sadness for what my daughter had endured and lost. "Where will you go?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "I was hoping. Your offer still stands? To stay with you for a while?" I reached over and took her gloved hand in mine. "My door is always open to you, Caroline. Always." She nodded, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "There's something else you should know. Something I found when I was packing." From her pocket, she withdrew a folded document, handing it to me with a shaking hand. I opened it carefully, my eyes widening as I scanned the contents. It was an email printout from Daniel to a private banker in the Cayman Islands, dated just 3 days earlier. The message detailed instructions for transferring $3.6 million from an account I'd never heard of, evidently an offshore repository for the funds he'd been siphoning from Reynolds Construction. "He's been hiding money," Caroline said unnecessarily. "Planning to declare bankruptcy, walk away from everything, and start over with millions tucked away where creditors can't reach it." I refolded the document carefully. "Does he know you? Found this?" She shook her head. "I made a copy and put the original back. He has no idea I know." "This changes things," I said thoughtfully. "With evidence of intentional fraud and hidden assets, the bankruptcy court would—" "I don't care about the legal implications," Caroline interrupted. "I just wanted you to know who you're dealing with, who I've been married to." Her voice broke slightly. "Who I chose over you." I squeezed her hand gently. "We all make choices we regret, Caroline. What matters is what we do afterward." She nodded, wiping away a tear with her free hand. "I filed for divorce this morning." That evening, Caroline moved into my guest room with 2 suitcases and a box of photo albums. She seemed simultaneously exhausted and relieved, like someone who'd been carrying a heavy weight for miles and had finally set it down. After she went to bed, I called Vivian and forwarded her the offshore account information. "This changes our approach," I told her. "With evidence of deliberate fraud and hidden assets, we can petition for an emergency injunction freezing all of Daniel's personal assets, not just the company's." "On what grounds?" Vivian asked, though I could hear her already typing notes. "Fraudulent conveyance. He's clearly preparing to drain assets that should be available to creditors." "I can have the motion prepared by morning," she confirmed. "This is the smoking gun we needed." The next day, while Daniel was presumably still scrambling to find financing to save Westfield Heights, we blindsided him from another direction entirely. Vivian filed for an emergency injunction in federal court, attaching the offshore account evidence. By noon, the judge had granted our motion, freezing not only Reynolds Construction's assets, but Daniel's personal accounts as well, including the Cayman Islands holdings, thanks to international banking treaties. The news hit the local business press immediately. Reynolds Construction CEO's assets frozen amid fraud allegations. By afternoon, the story had evolved. Offshore accounts revealed in Reynolds' financial scandal. I wasn't surprised when my doorbell rang that evening. I was, however, surprised to find not Daniel, but Howard Reynolds standing on my porch, looking weathered but determined. "I thought you were in Arizona," I said, stepping aside to let him in from the cold. "I was," he confirmed. "Got on the first flight back when I heard about the offshore accounts. This goes beyond what even I suspected." I led him to my living room, where Caroline was curled up with a book. She looked up, startled to see her father-in-law. "Howard," she said, rising awkwardly. "I didn't expect—" "It's all right, Caroline," he said gently. "I'm not here to judge or pressure you. In fact, I owe you an apology for not seeing sooner what Daniel was becoming." She nodded uncertainly, then excused herself, disappearing upstairs to give us privacy. Howard sank heavily into an armchair. I underestimated you, Eleanor. When I gave you the loan assignment, I thought you'd simply use it as leverage to negotiate a better position for the Westfield Heights investors, maybe force Daniel to bring in better management. He shook his head slowly. I never imagined you'd uncover offshore accounts or get a federal injunction. Your son underestimated. Me too, I replied. He thought I was just an aging accountant he could push aside when convenient. Howard's expression darkened. He's not taking this well. He showed up at my house an hour ago, raging, accusing me of betrayal. When I wouldn't help him access emergency funds, Howard touched his cheek, and I noticed for the first time a bruise forming along his jawline. He hit you? I asked, shocked, despite everything I knew about Daniel. Shoved me against the wall, Howard clarified, though the distinction seemed negligible. My nurse called the police. They're looking for him now. I felt a chill. Is Caroline in danger? Howard shook his head. I don't think so. His rage is directed at me, and at you. He sees us as the architects of his downfall, not Caroline. Nevertheless, I texted Vivian to arrange for private security at my house for the next few days. Daniel's deteriorating behavior had added an element of unpredictability that I hadn't fully anticipated. What happens now? Howard asked, sounding suddenly old and tired. Now we proceed with foreclosure on Westfield Heights, I said. Phoenix Recovery will take control, bring in proper management, and complete the project as it should have been done from the beginning. Howard nodded slowly. And Reynolds Construction? That's not my concern, I replied honestly. First, Meridian will handle the corporate bankruptcy proceedings for the rest of the company. Some assets will be liquidated, others reorganized. Whether the Reynolds name survives in any form will depend on the bankruptcy court's decisions. 40 years of work, Howard murmured, more to himself than to me. Gone because my son thought he was above the rules. I felt a twinge of sympathy for Howard, despite everything. He had built something meaningful, only to watch his son destroy it through greed and entitlement. Your legacy doesn't have to die with the company name, I said quietly. The buildings you built, the people whose careers you launched, the standards you set, those things endure. He looked up, a ghost of his former confidence flickering in his eyes. You're right. And perhaps there's still a way to salvage something meaningful from this wreckage. 2 days later, Daniel was arrested at the Canadian border, attempting to flee the country with fake identification and $50,000 in cash. The offshore account evidence, combined with his assault on Howard and attempted flight, ensured that bail was denied. He would remain in custody while facing a growing list of federal and state charges related to financial fraud, misappropriation of funds, and assault. With Daniel in jail and the 14-day deadline expired, Phoenix Recovery formally initiated foreclosure proceedings on Westfield Heights. As expected, no last-minute financing materialized to save the project. Reynolds Construction, now headless and hemorrhaging what remained of its value, filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, complete liquidation rather than reorganization. The morning of the foreclosure, I drove to the Westfield Heights construction site with Vivian and our newly assembled project management team. The development sat half completed, a skeletal monument to Daniel's hubris and fraud. Exposed beams, unfinished walls, and idle equipment stretched across the 20-acre site. As we walked through what would eventually be the central plaza, Howard Reynolds joined us, moving slowly but purposefully with his cane. I've been reviewing your plans for completing the project, he said without preamble. The revised blueprints, the upgraded materials, the new contracting team. It's good work, better than what Daniel had planned. Thank you, I replied, somewhat surprised by his presence. We've tried to stay true to the original vision while correcting the structural and safety issues. Howard nodded, surveying the site with a developer's experienced eye. I'd like to be involved if you're amenable, not as an owner. I've accepted that Phoenix Recovery now controls Westfield Heights. But perhaps as a consultant, these buildings were supposed to be my legacy. I'd like to ensure they're something I can be proud of, even if they no longer bear my name. I considered his offer. Having Howard's expertise would undoubtedly benefit the project, and there was something fitting about allowing him to complete what he'd started, even in this diminished capacity. I think that could be arranged, I said. We'll have our attorneys draw up a consulting agreement. He extended his hand, and we shook on it, a simple business gesture that somehow carried the weight of reconciliation and new beginnings. As we continued our tour of the site, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary turn of events that had brought me here. 3 months ago, I had been eating Thanksgiving dinner alone in a garage, humiliated and dismissed by my daughter and son-in-law. Now I stood as the owner of what would become, once properly completed, one of the most valuable real estate developments in Oak Ridge. But more important than the financial victory was the personal one. Caroline was home, beginning the slow process of rebuilding her life and our relationship. She had filed for divorce from Daniel and was starting therapy to understand how she'd lost herself in his world of appearances and status. "Eleanor," Vivian called, interrupting my thoughts. "The project manager needs your signature on these permits to restart construction." I nodded, returning to the present moment and the work ahead. There would be challenges, of course. Completing Westfield Heights properly would require significant additional investment beyond what we'd already committed. The tarnished reputation of the project would need to be rehabilitated through transparent communication and demonstrable quality. But as I signed the permit applications that would allow construction to resume, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Not because I had orchestrated Daniel's downfall, though his betrayal certainly deserved consequences, but because I had reclaimed my power, my dignity, and most importantly, my daughter. The foreclosure on their family business wasn't just about financial assets changing hands. It was about fundamental values being reasserted, about truth prevailing over deception, about substance triumphing over appearance. As we prepared to leave the site, I received a text message from Caroline. "Made dinner reservations for us tonight. A proper table this time. Love you, Mom." I smiled, putting my phone away. The garage dinner on Thanksgiving had been painful, but in retrospect, it had been necessary. The catalyst that awakened me from years of acquiescence and forced me to stand up, not just for my financial interests, but for my fundamental worth as a person. Some might call what I'd done revenge. I preferred to think of it as restoration, of balance, of dignity, of truth. And as I looked out over the Westfield Heights development that now belonged to Phoenix Recovery, I knew that from these half-built ruins something new and better would rise. Just as from the ashes of my relationship with Caroline, a stronger bond was already emerging. The mother who had been banished to eat in the garage had found her voice, her power, and ultimately, her redemption. And that was worth more than all the foreclosed property in the world. Spring arrived in Oak Ridge with unusual warmth, as if nature itself was eager to wash away the bitter winter. Cherry blossoms dotted the Westfield Heights construction site, their delicate pink petals occasionally drifting onto the newly poured concrete foundations. The development was now a hub of legitimate activity, with skilled workers and proper materials replacing the corner-cutting approach of Daniel's regime. I stood on what would eventually become the rooftop terrace of the main residential building, surveying the progress with quiet satisfaction. In the 3 months since Phoenix Recovery had taken control, the project had been completely reimagined, not just structurally but philosophically. What had begun as an exclusive enclave for the wealthy was evolving into a mixed-use development with varied housing options, community spaces, and environmentally sustainable features. "The solar panel installation starts next week," Howard I commented, joining me at the railing. Despite his initial consultant role, He had gradually become more involved, his decades of experience proving invaluable. Should reduce the overall carbon footprint by 30%. I nodded appreciatively. The solar initiative had been Howard's suggestion, part of his effort to transform what his son had corrupted into something genuinely beneficial for the community. The affordable housing applications open tomorrow, I added. We're expecting significant interest. 20% of the residential units had been designated as below-market-rate housing, integrated throughout the development rather than segregated as an afterthought. Howard smiled slightly. Daniel would have hated that. Diluting the brand, he would have called it. Good thing he's not in charge anymore, I remarked, unable to keep a hint of satisfaction from my voice. Daniel remained in custody, awaiting trial, having been denied bail for a second time after evidence emerged of additional offshore accounts. The criminal case against him had expanded to include tax evasion, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges. His legal team had recently approached the prosecutor's office about a potential plea deal, but no agreement had been reached. Howard's expression turned somber. I visited him last week, he admitted. It was the first time he'd mentioned seeing Daniel since the arrest. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, allowing him to continue at his own pace. He hasn't changed, Howard sighed. Still, blames everyone but himself. You, me, the banks, the system. He truly believes he's the victim in all this. Are you surprised? I asked gently. Howard shook his head. Disappointed, not surprised. I suppose I still harbored some hope that facing consequences might spark reflection or growth. He gazed out at the construction site, workers in hard hats moving purposefully below us. Instead, he's become more entrenched in his sense of entitlement. Some people never learn, I observed, no matter how hard the lesson. Howard nodded, then changed the subject. How's Caroline doing with the gallery preparations? The mention of my daughter brought a genuine smile to my face. In the month since leaving Daniel, Caroline had begun rediscovering interests and passions that had been suppressed during her marriage. Chief among these was her love of art, not just as a status symbol to be displayed in a mansion foyer, but as a means of expression and community building. The renovations are on schedule, I replied. The opening is set for next month. Caroline had used a portion of her divorce settlement to lease a vacant storefront downtown and transform it into a small art gallery and teaching space. Her vision was to showcase local artists and offer classes to underprivileged youth, as far from Daniel's world of exclusivity and appearances as one could imagine. I'm glad, Howard said sincerely. She deserves a fresh start. We all do. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. Meeting with the framing contractor just finished. Everything on track. Lunch later? I replied affirmatively, then turned back to Howard. The Zoning Commission asked for one more review of the community center plans. Could you join that meeting next Thursday? He nodded, making a note in his phone. Our working relationship had evolved into something approaching friendship, an unexpected development, but not an unwelcome one. We were united not just by our shared experience with Daniel's betrayal, but by a genuine desire to salvage something positive from the wreckage of Reynolds Construction. Just as we were preparing to leave the rooftop, Vivian appeared at the access door, tablet in hand and a concerned expression on her face. Eleanor, we need to talk, she said without preamble. There's been a development. Howard took the hint. I'll check on the Eastern Foundation work, he said, excusing himself tactfully. Once we were alone, Vivian handed me her tablet. I just received this from Martin Wells, Daniel's former attorney. The screen displayed an email with a PDF attachment. I skimmed the message, my pulse quickening as I grasped its implications. Is this legitimate? I asked, looking up at Vivian. Unfortunately, yes, she confirmed. Martin has left the firm that represented Reynolds Construction. He's now working independently and seems eager to distance himself from Daniel's activities, but the documents he's provided appear authentic. I've already verified several key details. I scrolled through the PDF, internal memos, email exchanges, and meeting notes that Martin had apparently retained. They painted a disturbing picture. Daniel's fraud went beyond what we had already uncovered. He had been systematically siphoning funds from not just Westfield Heights, but from every Reynolds construction project for the past 3 years, and he hadn't been working alone. "Gregory Patterson," I murmured, spotting the CFO's name repeatedly in the documents. He was complicit from the beginning. "And 3 board members," Vivian added, "plus several project managers who've already left the company." The scale of the conspiracy was staggering. What we had initially believed to be one man's hubris had actually been an organized scheme involving multiple executives, all collaborating to defraud investors, banks, and contractors. "Why is Martin sharing this now?" I asked immediately, suspicious of the timing. "Self-preservation," Vivian replied pragmatically. "The federal investigation is expanding. He claims he discovered these additional documents after leaving the firm and wants to cooperate before prosecutors come knocking on his door." I considered the implications. This could significantly impact Daniel's criminal case. "Absolutely," Vivian agreed. "What was already serious has just become potentially devastating. With evidence of a broader conspiracy, prosecutors will likely seek maximum penalties." While I processed this information, another notification appeared on the tablet, a breaking news alert from the Oak Ridge Business Journal. "Former Reynolds Construction CFO Patterson arrested in connection with fraud investigation." Events. We're moving faster than anticipated. The investigation that had begun with our evidence against Daniel was now spreading to engulf his accomplices. The foundations of power and privilege that had protected them were crumbling one by one. "There's something else," Vivian said hesitantly. "Near the end of those documents, there's a section about Caroline." My head snapped up. "What about Caroline?" "Nothing criminal," Vivian assured me quickly. "But it appears that Daniel was systematically isolating her, particularly from you. There are detailed notes about manipulating her perceptions, exploiting insecurities, even monitoring her communications." I felt a cold anger building as I found the relevant pages. There it was in clinical detail, Daniel's deliberate campaign to drive a wedge between mother and daughter. He had cultivated Caroline's material desires while subtly undermining her confidence and independence. The Thanksgiving garage incident hadn't been a spontaneous act of cruelty. It had been the culmination of a calculated strategy to completely sever our relationship. "She needs to see this," I said firmly, despite the pain I knew it would cause her. Vivian nodded in agreement. "I think so too. Better she understand the manipulation than continue to question her own judgment." I forwarded the relevant documents to my email, then texted Caroline to change our lunch plans. "Something important has come up. Can you come to my office instead? There's information you should see." An hour later, I sat with Caroline in my private office at Wright Financial, watching as she read through the evidence of Daniel's psychological manipulation. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, to a cold, focused anger that reminded me startlingly of myself. "That absolute monster," she finally said, setting down the tablet with deliberate control. "All this time I've been blaming myself for being weak, for letting him influence me against you. But this was systematic, premeditated." "It wasn't your fault," I said gently. "Professional manipulators are skilled at what they do. They target strengths as much as weaknesses." Caroline shook her head, still processing. "He used my desire to please, my social anxiety, even my childhood memories. That time he reminded me how you missed my 10th birthday party for work? You didn't miss it. You were there. I remember you bringing the cake. But he kept insisting you weren't, until I actually started doubting my own memory." The revelation of this specific manipulation technique, gaslighting Caroline about her own childhood memories, made my blood boil. But I maintained my composure, focusing on supporting my daughter through this painful revelation. "What matters now is that you're free of his influence," I said. "You recognized something was wrong, and you had the courage to leave." Caroline took a deep breath, visibly gathering her strength. "You know what's strange? Instead of making me feel worse, seeing this actually helps. It confirms I wasn't crazy or overly sensitive. My instincts were right. Something was deeply wrong." I smiled, impressed by her resilience. "Trust those instincts going forward. They're clearly more reliable than you've given them credit for." She reached across the desk and squeezed my hand. "Thank you for showing me this. It can't have been an easy decision." "Truth is always better than comfortable illusions," I replied. "Even when it hurts." Caroline nodded thoughtfully. "That's going to be the motto for my gallery. Truth over comfort. Speaking of which," she checked her watch, "I should get back. The lighting contractors are coming this afternoon." As she gathered her things to leave, she paused at the door. "Mom, I'm proud of what you did. Taking control of Westfield Heights, making it into something meaningful. It's not revenge, it's justice, and the community will benefit for generations." After she left, I sat reflecting on her words. Was it justice or revenge? Perhaps elements of both, though the distinction had become less important to me over time. What mattered was that out of Daniel's greed and betrayal, something positive was emerging. Not just the reclamation of Westfield Heights, but the reclamation of my relationship with Caroline, and even a new professional chapter for myself. Phoenix Recovery was evolving beyond its initial purpose. What had begun as a vehicle for gaining leverage over Westfield Heights was developing into a legitimate enterprise focused on rehabilitating troubled real estate projects. We had already been approached about another distressed development across town, and preliminary discussions were underway with investors interested in our model of combining financial viability with community benefit. My contemplation was interrupted by another text from Vivian. "You need to see this. Turning on your office TV now." The wall-mounted screen illuminated automatically, tuned to the local news channel where a breaking story was unfolding. Anduri. Camera showed police vehicles surrounding an upscale restaurant downtown, officers escorting a handcuffed man toward a waiting cruiser. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Breaking Reynolds Construction Board member James Harrington. Arrested on fraud charges." The reporter's voice provided context. "This is the third arrest today connected to the expanding Reynolds construction fraud investigation. Sources close to the investigation indicate that former CEO Daniel Reynolds may have been the architect of the scheme, but it required participation from numerous company executives to execute." I watched with a strange detachment as another domino fell. The Reynolds empire was collapsing completely, with each new arrest further validating our actions. What had initially appeared to be one man's malfeasance was revealing itself as a culture of corruption that had infected the entire corporate structure. My office phone rang. Howard, calling from the construction site. "Are you watching the news?" he asked without preamble. "Yes," I confirmed. "Harrington was on your board for what, 15 years? 18, Howard replied heavily. "I trusted him completely. He was a pallbearer at my wife's funeral." A pause. "I should have seen it, Eleanor. The signs were there if I'd been willing to look." "We all have blind spots when it comes to people we trust," I said, thinking of how long I'd allowed Caroline to drift away under Daniel's influence. "The reporters are starting to gather at Westfield Heights," Howard continued. "They want statements about how the project is continuing despite the scandal. Would you be willing to join me for a brief press conference? I think it would send a powerful message, the two of us standing together, moving forward despite what Daniel tried to destroy." I considered the request. Normally, I preferred to operate behind the scenes, letting financial results speak for themselves. But this situation was different. The Westfield Heights revival wasn't just a business transaction. It had become a symbol of recovery and renewal for the entire community. All right, I agreed. But let's focus on the future, not the past. The development, not the scandal. Absolutely, Howard concurred. 2:00 at the main entrance? I confirmed the time, then hung up, immediately beginning mental preparations for the impromptu press conference. As I jotted down talking points, my private line rang again, a number I didn't recognize. Eleanor Wright, I answered professionally. Ms. Wright, this is Assistant District Attorney Melissa Chen. I apologize for calling unexpectedly, but developments in the Reynolds construction case are moving quickly. I sat up straighter. I understand. How can I help you? We've received a request from Daniel Reynolds' new defense team. They're seeking a plea agreement, and as part of their proposal, Mr. Reynolds has offered to provide complete cooperation and testimony against his co-conspirators. This was unexpected. Daniel had maintained his innocence throughout, blaming others and circumstances for his predicament. A complete reversal suggested desperation. I see, I replied neutrally. And you're calling me because any potential plea agreement would include restitution provisions, the ADA explained. As the controlling entity for Westfield Heights and a significant creditor through Phoenix Recovery, you would need to be consulted regarding those provisions. I processed this information carefully. What exactly is he offering? Full disclosure of all financial improprieties, testimony against other executives, and cooperation in recovering hidden assets, she replied. In exchange, they're asking for consideration during sentencing. And what would that consideration entail? I asked, my tone cooling slightly. That's still being negotiated, the ADA admitted. But realistically, even with a favorable plea deal, Mr. Reynolds is looking at significant prison time. The evidence against him is overwhelming, particularly with these new revelations about the broader conspiracy. I considered my response carefully. On one hand, Daniel's cooperation could help recover more stolen funds and ensure his accomplices also face justice. On the other hand, the idea of him receiving any leniency, any reduction in consequences, struck me as fundamentally unjust given the deliberate nature of his actions. I appreciate you consulting me, Ms. Chen, I said finally. But I trust the district attorney's office to make appropriate decisions regarding plea arrangements. My primary concern is the Westfield Heights project, and ensuring it becomes what it always should have been, an asset to the community rather than a monument to greed. I understand, she replied. But there is one other element of his proposed deal that directly concerns you. She paused meaningfully. Daniel has specifically offered to relinquish any claims against properties held in his name jointly with Caroline, including their primary residence. This would streamline the divorce proceedings considerably. This was clearly intended as an incentive for me to support a plea arrangement. By simplifying Caroline's divorce and financial separation, Daniel was attempting to leverage my maternal instincts. My daughter's divorce proceedings are her business, not mine, I replied firmly, and certainly not a factor in decisions about criminal prosecution. Caroline is rebuilding her life on her own terms. She doesn't need concessions from Daniel to move forward. Understood, the ADA said, a note of approval in her voice. I'll convey your position to the DA. Thank you for your time, Ms. Wright. After hanging up, I sat for a moment, absorbing this latest development. Daniel's attempt to use Caroline as a bargaining chip, even from behind bars, demonstrated that he still hadn't grasped the fundamental lesson. He continued to view people as utilities, as means to an end rather than individuals with inherent dignity and worth. I arrived at Westfield Heights precisely at 1:45, parking in the newly established construction management area. Media vans were already positioned near the entrance, reporters doing preliminary stand-ups with the development as a backdrop. Howard was waiting in the site office, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I haven't done a press conference since before my stroke," he admitted as I joined him. "Not sure I remember how." "Just speak honestly," I advised. "That's all people really want to hear, especially after all the deception that's been uncovered." He nodded, straightening his tie. "I've been thinking about what to say. About Daniel. About the company I built that he corrupted." "Remember what we agreed," I cautioned. "Focus on the future, not the past." "Some aspects of the past need addressing," he insisted gently. "For my own peace of mind, if nothing else." Before I could respond, the site manager informed us that the press was assembled and ready. Howard and I walked together to the podium that had been hastily set up at the entrance to what would eventually be the Westfield Heights Central Plaza. About 24 reporters and cameramen had gathered, their equipment aimed at the podium. The audience had grown beyond just business journalists to include representatives from major networks and publications, a testament to how the Reynolds construction scandal had captured public attention. Howard stepped up first, adjusting the microphone with a steady hand. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice stronger than I had expected. "For those who don't know me, I'm Howard Reynolds, founder of Reynolds Construction, and now a consultant on the Westfield Heights project. I want to thank you all for coming today." He paused, surveying the crowd with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades in the public eye before his illness. "Many of you have been covering the ongoing investigation into financial improprieties at Reynolds Construction. The arrests, the allegations of fraud, the hidden assets. As the founder of that company, I want to say clearly and unequivocally, what happened was wrong. It violated every principle I tried to instill in the organization over 40 years, and for that, I am profoundly sorry." Howard's public apology caught me by surprise. We hadn't discussed this approach, but watching the reporters lean forward, attentively, I understood its power. In a business culture where leaders rarely accepted responsibility, Howard's straightforward acknowledgement was refreshing. "However," he continued, "today isn't about apologies or regrets. It's about renewal and moving forward. Westfield Heights was conceived as a cornerstone development for this community. Thanks to Phoenix Recovery and Eleanor Wright, that vision is being realized in ways that are actually superior to the original concept." He gestured for me to join him at the podium, which I did, standing beside him as cameras flashed. Ms. Wright's company took control of this project when it was on the verge of collapse. Under her leadership, it has been redesigned to include affordable housing units, sustainable energy features, and community spaces that will benefit all of Oak Ridge, not just the privileged few. Howard stepped back slightly, yielding the microphone to me. I hadn't prepared formal remarks, but found the words coming naturally. "Thank you, Howard. Westfield Heights represents more than just buildings and infrastructure. It represents our community's resilience and commitment to doing things the right way, even when the easier path might be cutting corners or prioritizing profit above all else." I gestured toward the construction activity visible behind us. "What you see here is a project being built on a foundation of integrity, both literally and figuratively. The concrete being poured meets the highest safety standards. The environmental impact has been minimized through innovative design. And perhaps most importantly, this development will serve the entire community, with housing options across income, levels, and public spaces accessible to all." A reporter raised her hand, and I nodded for her to proceed. "Ms. Wright, there are rumors that you acquired control of Westfield Heights as part of a personal vendetta against Daniel Reynolds, your former son-in-law. Would you care to comment?" The directness of the question created a momentary hush. I could feel Howard tense beside me, uncertain how I would respond to this provocation. I smiled slightly. "I understand why people might view business transactions through the lens of personal relationships. But Phoenix Recovery's interest in Westfield Heights was and remains primarily financial and community-oriented. We saw a valuable asset being mismanaged and an opportunity to create something beneficial while generating appropriate returns for our investors. Another reporter jumped in. But isn't it true that Daniel Reynolds made you eat Thanksgiving dinner in the garage last year? That seems pretty personal. I felt a flash of irritation at the tabloid nature of the question, but maintained my composure. Family dynamics are complex and rarely relevant to business decisions. What is relevant is that Westfield Heights is now moving forward under new management with stronger community benefits than originally planned. I prefer to focus on those positive developments rather than personal grievances. Howard stepped back to the microphone. If I may add, having worked closely with Ms. Wright over recent months, I can attest that her decisions regarding this project have been consistently guided by sound business principles and community benefit, not personal considerations. The press conference continued for another 15 minutes, with questions gradually shifting from the scandal to the development itself, the timeline for completion, the affordable housing application process, the solar initiative. By the end, the narrative had successfully transitioned from scandal to renewal, exactly as we had hoped. As the reporters dispersed, Howard shook my hand warmly. "Well handled," he said quietly. "Especially those personal questions." "Some things are better left in the past," I replied, "or at least kept private." He nodded in understanding. "The ADA called me too, about Daniel's plea offer. I told them essentially what you did, that it's their decision, not mine." "Daniel made his choices," I said simply. "Now he can face the consequences." As we walked back toward the site office, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Caroline, sent to both Howard and me. "Saw you both on the live stream. So proud of what you're creating together. The gallery walls are being painted today, coming together beautifully. Dinner at my place this weekend to celebrate progress?" I showed the message to Howard, who smiled genuinely for the first time that day. "I'd like that," he said. "Family dinner with no hidden agendas. What a concept." The phrase struck me as the perfect encapsulation of our journey. From the manipulative Thanksgiving dinner where I'd been banished to the garage, to a genuine family meal celebrating new beginnings, the contrast couldn't have been more profound. As Howard returned to consulting with the construction manager, I took a moment to stand alone at the edge of the development, looking out over what we were building. Not just condominiums and retail spaces, but a different kind of legacy than Daniel had envisioned, one based on inclusion rather than exclusion, sustainability rather than exploitation, truth rather than deception. The woman who had eaten Thanksgiving dinner alone in a garage had transformed her humiliation into purpose, her anger into creation. The foreclosure on their family business had become not just an act of justice, but a catalyst for something far more meaningful than revenge could ever be. 1 year later, as autumn leaves painted Oak Ridge in amber and gold, I stood on the completed rooftop garden of Westfield Heights' main building. The development had transformed from a half-built monument to greed into a thriving community where residents of various income levels shared beautifully designed spaces. Children played in the central plaza, while parents chatted on benches beneath newly planted maple trees. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the community center, bustling with activity, a cooking class in one room, a job skills workshop in another. "Quite a view, isn't it?" Howard remarked, joining me at the railing. Despite using a cane, his posture had improved significantly over the past year. Regular physical therapy and the satisfaction of meaningful work had rejuvenated him beyond what any doctor had predicted. "It exceeded even my expectations," I admitted, surveying the completed development with pride. "Remember when the housing lottery opened? I wasn't sure we'd fill all the affordable units." Howard chuckled. "Now we have a waiting list 300 names long." The affordable housing component, initially met with skepticism by investors, had become Westfield Heights' most acclaimed feature. By integrating varied housing options throughout the development rather than segregating them, we'd created a genuinely mixed community where teachers lived alongside doctors, retail workers alongside tech professionals. The Urban Planning Department at State University wants to use it as a case study, I mentioned. Professor Winters called yesterday about bringing students through for tours next semester. From scandal to educational model, Howard mused. Not a transformation I would have predicted. As we prepared to leave the rooftop, my phone buzzed with a notification from a news app. Daniel Reynolds, sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. For fraud, embezzlement. I showed the screen to Howard, who nodded solemnly. Justice served, finally. After months of legal maneuvering, Daniel's plea deal had collapsed when investigators discovered yet another hidden account he'd failed to disclose. The judge, clearly unimpressed by his selective cooperation, had imposed a sentence at the upper end of the federal guidelines. Caroline's gallery opening is at 7, I reminded Howard as we descended to the lobby. Will you be joining us? Wouldn't miss it, he confirmed. I've already arranged a car service. These evening events are getting harder on my old bones. I smiled at his self-deprecation. At 72, Howard had earned the right to occasional complaints, though he rarely indulged in them. Instead, he had channeled his energy into mentoring young architects and developers working on Phoenix Recovery's growing portfolio of projects. The elevator doors opened to reveal the gleaming lobby of Westfield Heights, where residents greeted us with friendly nods or casual waves. They knew us not as the people who had foreclosed on a failed development, but as the team who had delivered on promises of quality, sustainability, and community. Outside, the autumn afternoon was drawing to a close, streetlights beginning to illuminate the tree-lined boulevards. Howard's car service arrived promptly, and we parted ways with a promise to reconnect at the gallery opening. I drove myself downtown, where Caroline's gallery occupied a beautifully renovated storefront in what had once been a neglected block. Now, thanks partly to her presence, the area was experiencing a renaissance, with boutiques, cafes, and small businesses filling previously vacant spaces. Arriving early, I found Caroline directing the final preparations for her first major exhibition. Mom, perfect timing. What do you think of the lighting on the west wall? Too bright? I studied the illumination on a series of abstract canvases. It's perfect. Brings out the texture beautifully. Caroline had discovered a gift for curation, an eye for emerging talent that had quickly established her gallery as a significant cultural presence in Oak Ridge. More importantly, she had found her voice, confident, authentic, and entirely her own. The artist is nervous, she confided, gesturing toward a young woman arranging small sculptures on pedestals. First solo show. I told her we've already had interest from 3 serious collectors. I nodded approvingly, struck by how naturally Caroline had transitioned from corporate wife to arts entrepreneur. The insecure woman who had once deferred to Daniel's every preference had vanished, replaced by someone who trusted her own judgment and pursued her genuine passions. The youth program display is in the back room, she added, leading me through the main gallery. We've hung work from all 25 students. Caroline's most meaningful initiative had been a free arts education program for disadvantaged youth. Twice weekly, local teens gathered at the gallery to learn from professional artists, creating work that frequently stunned viewers with its raw emotional power. Impressive, I remarked, studying a powerful mixed-media piece created by a 17-year-old from Oak Ridge's most challenged neighborhood. This one has real depth. Tiana's already been offered a scholarship to the Art Institute, Caroline said proudly. Her first gallery show, and she's gotten serious attention. As we continued our tour, I marveled at the journey that had brought us here. From that humiliating Thanksgiving in the garage to this moment of genuine fulfillment, not just for me, but for Caroline as well. The path had been painful, but the destination made every difficult step worthwhile. By 7 o'clock, the gallery was filled with art enthusiasts, community leaders, and proud family members of the youth program participants. Howard arrived as promised, immediately engaging a young sculptor in animated conversation about her work. The mayor made an appearance, praising the gallery's contribution to downtown revitalization. Local business owners thanked Caroline for the increased foot traffic her exhibitions had brought to the area. Parents of youth program students expressed heartfelt gratitude for opportunities their children might otherwise never have experienced. Midway through the evening, Caroline clinked a glass for attention. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice steady and confident. "When I opened this space a year ago, I had a vision of art as something that belongs to everyone, that brings people together across differences. Looking around tonight, I see that vision becoming reality." She gestured toward the youth program display. "These young artists remind us that talent exists everywhere, but opportunity doesn't. By bridging that gap, we enrich not just individual lives, but our entire community." As applause filled the room, I felt a profound sense of rightness. This was Caroline's true self emerging, compassionate, purposeful, connected to something larger than status or appearances. "I want to thank two people who made all this possible," she continued, her gaze finding Howard and me in the crowd. "My mother, Eleanor, who taught me that it's never too late to reclaim your life and your purpose, and Howard, whose guidance and support have been invaluable to both of us during challenging times." More applause followed, but I barely heard it. I was too caught in the emotion of the moment, the realization that out of that terrible Thanksgiving had come this beautiful new reality, not just for me, but for Caroline, for Howard, and for the hundreds of people now living in and benefiting from Westfield Heights. After the formal program concluded, guests lingered, examining artwork and engaging in animated conversations throughout the gallery. I found a quiet moment with Caroline, near a striking landscape painting. "I heard about Daniel's sentencing," she said softly. 12 years. I nodded, watching her face carefully for signs of distress. "How do you feel about it?" She considered the question thoughtfully. "Relieved, mostly. That chapter is truly closed now." She paused, tracing the frame of the painting with her fingertip. "You know, I've been thinking about the garage dinner a lot lately." "Have you?" I asked, surprised by the reference to a memory she typically avoided. At the time, it was just about appearances, making sure Daniel's investors saw only what he wanted them to see. But looking back, I realize it was symbolic of something deeper. "What do you mean?" "He wanted to keep you out of sight because you represented truth," Caroline explained. "You saw through the facade, the performance. You were the one person who might have exposed the lie we were living." She shook her head slowly. "I didn't understand that then." "And now?" I prompted gently. "Now I understand that authenticity is everything," she replied, gesturing around the gallery. "This place works because it's real. The art is honest. The community we're building is genuine. There's no pretense, no performance." Howard approached, champagne glass in hand. "Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to toast to Caroline's success before I head home. These old bones don't party like they used to." We clinked glasses, the three of us forming an unlikely family unit forged in the aftermath of betrayal and collapse. "To new beginnings," Howard offered. "To truth over appearances," Caroline added. "To the unexpected gifts that come from our greatest challenges," I concluded. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Caroline and I stood on the sidewalk outside the gallery, looking up at the illuminated sign bearing her name. "What's next for you, Mom?" she asked. "Phoenix Recovery is thriving. Westfield Heights is a success. Are you thinking about actual retirement anytime soon?" I laughed softly. Not just yet. We've acquired another distressed property on the East Side, an abandoned factory we're converting into affordable live workspaces for artists and craftspeople. Caroline raised an eyebrow. Sounds familiar. A certain gallery owner might be interested in a satellite location. The thought had crossed my mind, I admitted with a smile. Partners? Partners, she agreed, linking her arm through mine. As we walked toward our cars, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past year. The woman who had been banished to eat Thanksgiving dinner in a garage had not only reclaimed her dignity, but had found an entirely new purpose. By foreclosing on the Reynolds family business, I had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately liberated not just myself, but Caroline, Howard, and countless others affected by our projects. Some might still call it revenge, but I knew better. It was restoration, of values, of relationships, of community. Through the painful process of standing up for myself, I had discovered strengths I never knew I possessed and possibilities I had never imagined. This Thanksgiving would be different. Caroline was hosting dinner at her loft above the gallery. Howard would attend, along with several artists and students from the youth program who had nowhere else to go for the holiday. We would gather around a table built by a local craftsman, sharing food and stories as equals. No garages, no hidden agendas, no performances. Just truth, gratitude, and the profound understanding that sometimes the most painful rejections lead us precisely where we need to go. 5 years had passed since that fateful Thanksgiving in the garage. Oak Ridge had changed, and so had I. Phoenix Recovery had evolved from a single-purpose entity created for Westfield Heights into one of the region's most respected community development organizations. We now managed a portfolio of 8 properties, each combining affordable housing with community spaces and small business incubators. What had begun as an act of self-preservation had blossomed into a second career more fulfilling than I could have imagined. Today, I stood at the edge of our newest project, a former textile factory transformed into mixed-income housing and workspaces. The grand opening ceremony had drawn hundreds of community members, local officials, and media. The mayor had just finished cutting the ribbon, and visitors were now exploring the renovated space, admiring the preserved industrial architecture blended with modern sustainable features. "You should be proud," a familiar voice said beside me. It was Jessica Torres, the Oak Ridge Enterprise journalist who had covered the Reynolds construction scandal from its beginning. She had since become a respected business reporter known for holding corporations accountable. "It's a team effort," I replied, watching a group of children discover the courtyard playground. "Phoenix Recovery may have started with me, but it's grown well beyond one person's vision." Jessica nodded, jotting notes in her small, leather-bound notebook. "Still, quite a journey from that Thanksgiving dinner in the garage. Mind if I ask how that experience changed you?" I considered her question carefully. It was a watershed moment, the point when I finally understood that allowing others to diminish my worth wasn't a form of love or sacrifice. It was a surrender of something essential. "And Daniel? Any contact since his sentencing?" I shook my head. "None, though I understand he's eligible for parole next year." "Does that concern you?" "Not anymore," I replied honestly. The person I was then, the one he could manipulate and dismiss, doesn't exist anymore. As Jessica continued her interview, I spotted Caroline across the courtyard, leading a tour for potential retail tenants interested in the ground floor commercial spaces. At 38, my daughter had grown into a formidable businesswoman while maintaining the artistic sensibility that had first drawn her to gallery work. Her downtown space had expanded to 3 locations, each specializing in different art forms and community programs. The divorce from Daniel had been finalized years ago, and with it, Caroline had reclaimed not just her maiden name, but her authentic self. She had recently started dating again, cautiously, thoughtfully, a composer who taught music in underprivileged schools. Unlike Daniel, He valued Caroline for her mind and heart, rather than her appearance or social connections. After finishing, with Jessica, I made my way through the building, greeting community partners and residents who would soon move into the affordable units. Among the crowd, I spotted Howard, now using a motorized wheelchair but still sharp as ever at 77. He was deep in conversation with two architecture students interning with Phoenix Recovery, gesturing animatedly as he explained some design principle. Howard caught my eye and motioned me over. "Eleanor, these young people didn't believe that the community garden was my suggestion," he said with mock indignation. "Tell them I occasionally have good ideas." I laughed, playing along. Once every decade or so, he gets it right. The students grinned, clearly charmed by the banter between us. Over the years, Howard and I had developed a friendship that surprised us both, born from shared trauma, but sustained by mutual respect and complementary skills. Though he had no official role at Phoenix Recovery, he remained a valued advisor and mentor to our expanding team. "They're going to help with the vertical garden installation next week," Howard explained. "I've been sharing some of the lessons we learned at Westfield Heights." The mention of Westfield Heights brought a smile to my face. Our first major project had become something of a legend in urban planning circles, a case study in how to transform a troubled development into a thriving community. Property values had stabilized at sustainable levels, businesses in the commercial spaces were flourishing, and the community center hosted everything from job fairs to citizenship classes. As the afternoon wore on, I found a quiet moment to step away from the crowds and reflect. 5 years ago, when I had sat alone in that cold garage with a plate of lukewarm turkey, I could never have predicted this outcome. The humiliation and betrayal had seemed like an ending, the final severing of family bonds I had spent decades nurturing. Instead, it had been a beginning. The garage incident had awakened something dormant inside me, a fierce determination not just to survive, but to thrive on my own terms. In foreclosing on the Reynolds family business, I hadn't simply enacted revenge. I had reclaimed my power and redirected it toward creation rather than destruction. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. "The mayor wants photos with us and Howard by the main entrance. Where are you?" I texted back that I'd be there in a moment, then took one last look around the converted factory. Sunlight streamed through the original clear-story windows, illuminating the common area where residents would soon gather for meals, meetings, and celebrations. Unlike the exclusive spaces Daniel had envisioned at Westfield Heights, this was a place designed for connection across differences: economic, cultural, generational. As I walked toward the entrance, I passed a wall where community members had written their hopes for the building. One comment in particular caught my eye. "A place where everyone has a seat at the table." The phrase resonated deeply. That was exactly what had been denied to me that Thanksgiving: a seat at the table, recognition of my basic dignity and worth. Now, creating spaces where everyone belonged had become my life's work. The annual Thanksgiving tradition Caroline and I had established had grown each year, expanding to include not just Howard, but residents from our developments, gallery artists, youth program participants, and others who might otherwise spend the holiday alone. We had outgrown Caroline's loft and now held the celebration in the Westfield Heights Community Center, where long tables accommodated nearly 100 guests of all ages and backgrounds. There were no assigned seats, no hierarchy, no judgment, just shared food and genuine conversation. Everyone contributed what they could, whether an elaborate dish from a family recipe or simply an extra set of hands for cleanup. What mattered wasn't the perfection of the presentation, but the authenticity of the connection. As I joined Caroline and Howard for the photos, I felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over me. The garage dinner, painful as it had been, had ultimately delivered me to this purposeful new chapter. By standing up for myself that day, by refusing to accept disrespect any longer, I had set in motion a transformation far more profound than mere revenge. Daniel had banished me to the garage because he saw me as inconvenient, irrelevant to his carefully curated image. In doing so, he had inadvertently released me from the constraints of others' expectations and freed me to discover my own untapped potential. 5 years later, the woman who had eaten alone among garden tools and old paint cans now stood at the center of a community she had helped create, not as a victim seeking justice, but as a builder crafting something meaningful from the rubble of betrayal. Sometimes, I reflected as the camera flashed, our greatest pain leads us to our greatest purpose. And sometimes, being excluded from someone else's table is exactly what we need to build a better, more inclusive one of our own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.